Karma Coffee Cafe, our climate conversation with U.S. Senator Michael Bennet. One more round of applause. I want to welcome you all here. I'm Robert Hope, State Senator, Senate District 33 in Cedar Rapids, and it's great to have you all here. It's always interesting doing these events at small businesses like Karma Coffee Cafe. So let's have a round of applause for Sue, Taylor, Heidi, Brandon, and Diane, the owners. Thank you so much for letting us do this. And keep working those orders while the program goes if you want to get something, because they need your support. Let me just make a couple introductory remarks. First of all, it is imperative, and let me say this too, in the interest of time, Senator Bennet, we need to end this program we need to be getting people out of here by 6 p.m. And that means we're going to end the program by 5:35, 5:40, so that you have time to individually visit with Senator Bennet. So that's the program on the timing. Let me just make a couple introductory remarks. Number one, we need to win because Trump has been an absolute calamity on climate change and a whole bunch of other issues. We need to win so that we can bring Americans together to take the climate action we so urgently need with the many climate solutions that work. I had the opportunity, it was a really great opportunity yesterday, to visit the Iowa Flood Center at the University of Iowa with Senator Bennet yesterday. It was great to get to see him in action, learning about one of the things the state of Iowa has done to try to deal with climate change, which is set up a flood center to give us the information we need so that someday we can prevent the level of flood damage that we have been suffering even as the climate changes. A little bit about Senator Bennet. He's been a business person. He's been the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, and he's been a United States Senator since he was appointed in 2009. And in a battleground state of Colorado, he's won twice in tough elections years 2010, 2016. And without further ado, it is my honor to introduce to you United States Senator Michael Bennet.
Let's give Rob a round of applause for his leadership setting up these opportunities for candidates and for all of you to meet together face to face, which I think is what we really need as the antidote in this time of Twitter from the White House. So thank you for doing this, because I think this really is what democracy actually does look like, and we've got to find a way to talk to each other again as friends, not as enemies in this country. We've got to find a way to unify each other in our country through this campaign. Maybe I'll say a word about climate. Should I do that and then stop and see what people would like to talk about?
Take questions.
I'm happy, and I'll be very brief because I want to spend the time in a conversation with all of you. I'm happy to take questions on climate or any other topic that you've got questions about. I've been in the Senate, as Rob said, for the last 10 years, and one of the things that has really disturbed me about Donald Trump's election as president, it meant that we put a climate denier in the White House. And it should be kind of a definitional matter that a person should be disqualified from being president of the United States if they believe that climate change is real. He did not hide this. He ran on his climate denial. And he made the argument, and he won the case the last time he ran, that if we do what needs to be done on climate in this country, that we will destroy the U.S. economy. We should never have lost that argument to Donald Trump because it is blatantly untrue. It is patently untrue. And that's why Senator Hogue is working on this issue in the way he's working on the issue, because he knows if we don't address climate change, Iowa's economy will be destroyed as a result. Colorado's economy will be destroyed as a result. Florida, where we had the debate in Miami, has not grappled with climate change either, and they know that if they don't, their economy is going to be destroyed as a result. So the idea that just putting it off or putting our heads in the sand and somehow that will either take care of itself or our economy will be fine is false. Second, there are plenty of jobs that can be created if we actually were pursuing global leadership in climate here in the United States. I want our country, not China, to be the biggest exporter of climate technology in the world, and we can do that if we've got a president who doesn't deny that climate change is real. When I did the analysis of how a guy could get elected president as a climate denier, it made me wonder how we had pursued the politics on our side. That is, those of us that are advocates for dealing with climate, how we had thought about it. And I think that we spent a fair amount of time thinking about how to mobilize people who already agreed with us, but we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to reach out to other people on climate. And my climate proposal, which is called the American Climate Change Plan, it should be called the American Climate Crisis Plan, is on my website. And if you go to it, what you'll see is that I call for a focus on conservation when it comes to climate. Thinking about how to use our lands and our oceans to sequester carbon. Can we get to a point in this country where we're actually paying farmers so that they are able to sequester carbon in the working lands of the United States? Can we build a new coalition on this subject if we do? It calls for the investment of $1 trillion of public money to leverage another $10 trillion of private money that I believe will create 10 million climate-related jobs over the next 10 years. It calls, as I mentioned earlier, for the export of climate technology from the United States overseas so that manufacturers here in the United States can once again find markets overseas for their climate technology. And it calls for the reduction of emissions by 50% on transit and 50% on our built environment by 2030, as well as net zero carbon by 2050, which is what the scientists say we need to get to in order to create a sustainable path on climate. I just want to close on climate by saying one last thing. It is really important that we act urgently on climate. And the reason we have to act urgently is, and the next generation knows this better than anybody, the problem may not be fixable by the time they are in my job, which is why we have to get started now, which is why the issue is different than some of the issues that we face. As a former school superintendent, for example, it keeps me up at night that our education system is today reinforcing the income inequality in this country rather than liberating people from it. That worries me a lot, as somebody who worries about our democracy. But we will fix that problem. I wish we'd fix it today, but the problem will still be there, I'm sad to say, 10 years from now if we don't deal with it now. Climate's different than that. We may not be able to fix it 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So that's why we have to act urgently. But as we act urgently, we also need to create a durable solution on climate. Because we've gotten to this place, when it comes to our politics in Washington, where our standard is so low for success that it's become self-defeating. Think about the number of politicians you've met who come back home from Washington, D.C., say we didn't get anything done, and blame the other side for not getting it done. We have perfected that art. We're really good at that art. We should expect more from our politicians than that. But the second thing we sometimes do is we've got to the point where we're in this game of ping pong, where we put in policies for 2 years and then they get ripped out, and then some other policies come in and then they get ripped out, and some other policies come in and they get ripped out. You cannot address climate change 2 years at a time. It is impossible. So thank you. So not only do we have to act urgently, but we have to construct a durable solution, a solution that will last a generation and beyond a generation. And in order to do that, I'm just going to be completely candid about it, we have to reconstruct our politics. Now, I think we've got to reconstruct it on all kinds of levels, relating to all kinds of things. And we've got to clean up the money in our politics. We've got to end partisan gerrymandering at the national level, as you've done in Iowa. There are a bunch of other things I'll suggest during the Q&A that we can do to clean it up. But there's no better example of what's wrong with our current politics, why it is self-defeating, and while it will make it impossible for us to do what we need to do for the next generation, than climate change. That is a call not for you to give up, but it's an invitation for everybody here to lean in and do their part as citizens in this country to make sure we create, that we don't just beat Donald Trump, which is critical, but that we figure out how to govern this country again and begin to take the long view again, as our parents and grandparents did in their time on the issues that concerned us. I know that Senator Hope believes climate should become a fundamental organizing principle for our society and for our political system. I agree with him on that, and I think we can do it. So thanks for being here today. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start it off. Well, no, I'll just go ahead. Jan, let's start with you.
Either way.
Are you familiar with the Energy Innovations Act? And if so, is this something that you would bring to the Senate and find this is a bipartisan bill, and find someone on the other side to introduce it to the Senate?
Is it in the House?
Jan's question is about the Energy Innovation Act, which is the carbon fee and dividend proposal of a nonprofit advocacy group, Citizens Climate Lobby. And it would impose a fee on carbon dioxide, refund it all to the people of the United States as a dividend.
Right. I actually haven't looked at that exact bill.
We can get you information.
I will take the information. I think that, and I've said before that I would support a price on carbon. I think that's an efficient way of dealing with what's in front of us right now. I think there are some more not plausible, but doable actions that we could take right now along the lines of what I've suggested in my climate plan and in some other climate plans that could move the ball forward. And that's, so I'll take a look at it. Thank you.
That will also create jobs and all kinds of economic
Right,
movement.
right. One way of thinking about bills like that, depending on how it's structured, is that it's actually, in a sense, a carbon tax cut for virtually everybody because of the way the dividend works if it's done properly. And we just have to figure out a way to explain it better, I think, to the American people.
All right. Here, let's go.
I'll let you be the MC.
A lot of hands, that's good. Let's go back to Billy, and then we'll come up here to Phil, and we'll see where we go from there.
Senator Bennet, thank you for coming. Where do you stand on the renewable fuel standard, and how would your administration look at it?
I've supported it the whole time that I've been in the Senate. I think that it's important for us to continually innovate all the time and make sure that our renewable fuel standard is actually a driver of innovation rather than not. So that's something we need to pay attention to. But I think it's worked well, and we would continue to pursue it. Thank you.
Here, go to here, Phil.
I want to follow up on the price on carbon question from Jan here. I read your front online, and you also state that you are all in favor of science and fact-based decision making. And while all economists virtually are in agreement that the price on carbon, the fee dividend, is the most efficient solution, I'm curious as to why you're not mentioning it at all on your website,
Sure.
and why you're not a little more full-throated in your support.
Glad to have that conversation. I appreciate it. I think we're living at a time in our country's history when there has been no economic mobility for the bottom 90% of the American people over 40 years. And we're living at a time when whenever the economy grows, the benefit of that growth all goes to the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%. We have the greatest income inequality that we've had since 1928. In my state, Colorado, which has one of the strongest economies of any state in America, if I had to sum up the last 10 years of town hall meetings, it would be that people say to me that while they're working really hard, they can't afford housing, they can't afford health care, they can't afford a higher education or early childhood education. The parents that don't show up to my town halls but are the parents of the children I used to work for in the Denver Public Schools, and they're not showing up sometimes because they're working 2 and 3 jobs, are working incredibly hard and feel like no matter what they do, they can't move their families out of poverty. I think those economic issues need to be understood as we think about what sort of taxes we put on the American people, even with the kind of dividend that is talked about here. Because if they're not, there is the potential that this work divides the American people even further rather than unifying the American people. And I think that's why I'm more cautious than you would like me to be. That's the candid reason why. And I think we just need the opportunity to have a full debate here in the United States of America and decide how we proceed. I think at the end of all of this, there's quite likely the possibility that people decide that there's a trade to be made here for less of a, not from the Trump administration obviously, but in an administration that is taking seriously our responsibility with respect to climate change, that there could be a trade that that streamlines some regulation in favor of a fee on carbon, which is one of the reasons why the economists support it, because it's such an efficient way of dealing with the issue. So that, I think, is why you've seen tentativeness, not just from me, but every other Democrat that's in the field that's seen, or some of the Democrats in the field, that have seen, that have that concern, and that is my concern. Thanks.
Senator Bennet, I'm going to take you in a little different direction while we get ready for the next round of questions. Obviously, we've been talking about clean energy, and hey Diane, can you cut the music off? We got started with the music going. I apologize. Yeah, I was about to break out in some rumba dancing, like that.
I'd pay to see that.
So, Senator Bennet, one of the aspects of this issue that doesn't get enough attention is just the extraordinary damage that goes with these climate-related disasters. I know you've lived it with the Colorado floods of 2013. We obviously lived it with the Iowa floods of 2008, 2011, 2016, 2019. And it is, economically devastating and real emotional heartache for people that go through that. Talk to me, and then, let me just add this. Think about what Trump has done on disaster relief. He goes to Puerto Rico and he throws out paper towels. People remember that?
Yeah.
He talks about California and he says you should rake your forests after a town of 25,000 was destroyed. I mean, just very callous and misguided. What are your thoughts about disaster relief and hazard mitigation and how we might build that into a national policy to safeguard Americans?
Thank you. That's a great question. First, 2 weeks ago, I introduced a new bill, the name of which I don't remember while I'm standing here. But it's actually the first piece of bipartisan climate legislation that has been introduced in this Senate. And it is a piece of, it's with a Republican senator from Louisiana, and it would give people a tax credit to be able to do mitigation on their private homes and properties because of mitigation they have to do for climate change. So that we don't have to wait until the flood has happened, until the fire has happened, to make the kind of improvements that we need to be able to move forward. So it is pretty amazing to actually have a Republican sign on to a climate bill, and there's one that has to do with mitigation. In my state, we've had the flooding, which is similar here, but the conditions are different. So let me describe that a little bit. In 2013, we had an unbelievable rain in 1 or 2 days that led to terrible floods and terrible destruction all across the mountains and front range of Colorado, and it took us a long time to dig out from it. By the way, that was the flood that, when I went back and everybody was working so hard, just like you were working hard when you had your floods, to make sure that people were rescued, to make sure that businesses were put back together again, communities were put back together. That was when Ted Cruz had shut the government down in Washington. So all these people were working so hard back out in Colorado, and we had the government shut down over politics because of Cruz. What I came to see was the resilience of the people who I represent in my state, the resilience of people that came from all over the world, as I'm sure they did here, to help dig out from underneath those floods. But it also is a reminder of the resilience we need for this country. And in Colorado, we have had terrible drought. And the temperatures in the wintertime have not fallen low enough to kill things like the spruce bark beetle, which means those beetles have eaten trees and killed the trees in Colorado. So the conditions of the national forests are terrible. And by the way, until very recently, the Forest Service didn't have the funding to do any of the mitigation work that needed to be done. This connects to water because anybody who's downstream from Colorado is downstream from the watersheds that are all up at 14,000 feet above our national forest. So the national forests are in terrible condition. If we have a flood, that creates huge problems downstream. And so I've spent 10 years trying to end what's called fire borrowing in Washington, which means the Forest Service had natural disasters treated differently than all other natural disasters. And fighting fires had to come out of the Forest Service budget rather than out of disaster money. And that meant by, just a couple or 3 years ago, for the first time, we were spending over half the Forest Service budget fighting fires instead of doing the kind of mitigation we should have done at the beginning. That is the worst example I can think of being penny wise and pound foolish. This administration, I have to say, Secretary Perdue, who's from Georgia, led a fight for us to be able to end fire borrowing and to make sure that the Forest Service budget was treated the same way as others and allow us to use the money now for mitigation. That's just one illustration, but there are countless jobs that are high-paying jobs that can be created in America if we put people to work doing the kind of mitigation we need on our forests and other places. I have wished for a long time that we had a program for veterans who could come back from Afghanistan and Iraq and go to work if they wanted to in our national forest, working outside, working in teams, being able to learn a trade that then allowed them to transition onto the federal workforce. Tom Vilsack and I talked a lot about trying to do something like that when he was the Agriculture Secretary, and I think it still would be a very good idea. Great.
All right, who's got another question? Here, let's go back here to you.
Okay, first of all, I know Senator Bennett's father, knew Senator Bennett's father quite well. He was a leader in the civil rights movement. I didn't know your mother, but I understand she fled from the Holocaust.
Right.
So, I wonder if you might talk about your own kind of empathetic feeling about immigrants coming to this country, and also about the question of the BDS. Well, I would bring that in. I don't know if you want to touch that question or not.
Well, that's okay. Well, let me start on the because we got a hat here and it says immigrants make America great. I certainly feel that way about my mother and her parents. They were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust in and around Warsaw, Poland. They were the only people that did survive with an aunt. My grandfather didn't want to leave because he didn't want to leave his family behind. In the end, everybody was killed except for my mom and her parents and an aunt. And they lived in Warsaw for 2 years after the war was over. Then they went to Stockholm, Sweden for a year. Then they went to Mexico City, of all places, for a year. And then they came to New York City where they were able to rebuild their shattered lives. My mom was the only one in the family who could speak any English, and she enrolled herself in the New York City public schools. My grandparents started a small business that they had in Warsaw, again, here in the United States. And as a result of what they did, they were able to pay for my education and give me every privilege that this country can confer in one generation of Americans. And sometimes I hear people say, oh my gosh, my grandparents would never believe that I was standing here in the United States Senate or running for president or whatever. My grandmother would say, my babcia in Polish would say, that's the way America's supposed to work. And the other thing I'll say is, I've got a lot of people in my state that are immigrants from other places, and I've been all over the the state of Colorado over and over again. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. I have never met a person in my state with a thicker accent than my grandparents had, and I have never known anybody who's a greater patriot than my grandparents were. Their sheer joy of being Americans. And so, in 2013, I had the chance to be part of the Gang of Eight who wrote the comprehensive immigration bill in the Senate. We had 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans that spent about 7 months working together to produce that bill. Just for memory's sake, since Donald Trump seems to have forgotten it altogether, we created a pathway to citizenship with 11 million people that are here, that are undocumented. We had the most progressive DREAM Act that had ever been written, much less passed on the floor of the Senate. And we had $46 billion of border security in that bill. But it wasn't an ineffective wall that the Mexicans were supposed to pay for. It was 21st century border security that allowed us to see every inch of the border. We doubled the number of border security agents. We dealt with the problem we have in internal security in America. 40% of the people that came here that are undocumented came lawfully but overstayed their visas. We have no way to know in America today who they are or whether they're here and we want them here or whether we'd like them to do something else. So this idea that Democrats are for open borders, which is what the president says every day, is completely false. Every single Democrat in the Senate at that moment voted for that bill. And I voted for that bill, and a number of Republicans voted for it too. And the only reason it's not the law of the land is that the House of Representatives could not overcome the absurdity of the Hastert rule, which some of you may know is this rule named after a former Speaker of the House who's no longer the Speaker of the House and I think is in prison. And what it allowed was for Steve King and that cast of characters that call themselves the Freedom Caucus to once again exercise a veto over the popular will of the United States, the people of the United States of America. There is no better example of that veto than what they did on immigration. Final point I'll make is on the refugees. My mom doesn't usually, she does call me, but she doesn't usually call me and tell me how to do my job. She lets my siblings do that. She calls them and then they call me. But she called the first day that there was the reports of kids being separated from their parents at the border, and she said to me, Michael, I see myself in those kids. Because she would, and I'm not saying there's any equivalency between the Holocaust and what's going on in the border, except for my mom, who was separated from her parents for about 3 or 4 years and was told that they were dead. She didn't know that they were alive until after the war was over, and they came to find her outside of where they were in Warsaw. And she knows and I know that the effects of that kind of trauma on the children last a lifetime and into another generation. And that's why what we're doing down there is so wrong and so unnecessary, so un-American. The idea that this president has turned our border, the southern border of the United States, into a symbol of nativist hostility, a symbol of anti-immigrant hostility from a country that, before he was president, used to be known for the Statue of Liberty, is something that we really have to work hard to recover. And I think it's a real demonstration of how weak a country he thinks America is. We're a strong and powerful country. We can respond humanely to this refugee crisis on this border. We can respond with leadership in this hemisphere that says that these refugees are humans that are not fleeing for jobs, but fleeing for their lives, and we can come together with our allies in the hemisphere to figure out how we can respond together to deal with the crisis, but also to deal with the reasons.
Representative House District 67. Eric Kearney.
I want to talk about infrastructure in more rural Iowa. We've actually been losing population, right? One is massive broadband internet, because that actually can reduce the need for cars. I work out of my house, right? I don't have to drive anywhere anymore. I was up in Minnesota for 2 years, and you'd sit bumper up the traffic for 45 minutes. right? And that's not productive at all, right? Especially women who have children don't want to spend 2 hours sitting in the car, right? We could build up internet services so more people could even a couple of days a week work out of their house, right? Or work close to where they live, right? And that could cut down on the number of vehicles. And the other is the infrastructure on trains. I actually took a trip to Colorado last year, and I looked into the Amtrak, and I finally had to decide, no, I couldn't take it, right? Because they talked at 7-hour delays, and the tracks were old, and all of this stuff, right? That, you'd love to take a Amtrak to Colorado and see Nebraska and so forth, but you can't really do it, right? Because our trains are so bad.
So, a couple thoughts. One, putting my old school superintendent hat on. The idea that we have accepted as a country that there are some kids in America that are going to have access to high-speed internet, and other kids in America, mostly kids living in rural areas, are not going to have access to high-speed internet, is the absolute equivalent to accepting that some kids in America are going to get textbooks and other kids in America are not going to get textbooks. There is no difference. That is profoundly unjust, and even if we didn't need it for business purposes, we should be doing it for educational purposes. We need to be doing it for healthcare purposes, because if you live in rural America, it's very likely that the medicine you're going to get is going to be telemedicine, and it's going to be hard for you to get a primary care physician sometimes, or a primary care nurse, and we need you to be hooked up to the internet to be able to do that. It's deeply unfair to say that you can only do that if you're in a city, unless we're going to decide that we don't believe rural America should exist. That's a fundamental question that we have to decide. When you see these hospitals going away because of the cuts to Medicaid that these guys were threatening when they're talking about overturning the Affordable Care Act, to me that's tantamount to asking a question, do you want rural America to survive? Because it can't survive if there aren't hospitals. It can't survive if there isn't broadband internet. It's critically important, as you were pointing out, to our economy, to be able to build a small business, to provide economic growth for a community to have high-speed access to the internet. And you nested the question, as you should have, in the broader question of infrastructure. We are at a point, we have to admit, this wasn't even Donald Trump who did this, but I'll come back to that in a minute. We are at a point where we do not have the decency even to maintain the assets and infrastructure that our parents and grandparents had the decency to build for us, much less build the infrastructure our kids are going to need in the 21st century. We're not doing it. And why aren't we doing it? There are a bunch of reasons, but here's a fundamental reason. Since 2001, we have borrowed $5 trillion to give $5 trillion of tax cuts, most of which went to the wealthiest people in America, and exacerbating the income inequality that we had. Borrowed it. We didn't pay for it. We borrowed it from the Chinese and stuck our kids with the bill for the privilege of giving the wealthiest people in America tax cuts. And Donald Trump just did the same thing. And the second thing that we've done is we spent $5.6 trillion in the Middle East. We borrowed all of that too. By the way, parenthetically, the second Bush tax cut in 2003 actually came after we already had troops committed in Afghanistan and Iraq. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine our parents sending people to the battlefield in the Middle East and not only not paying for it, but then cutting taxes after they were there and borrowing the money from the Chinese to do it? That's how irresponsible Washington has been. And what that has meant is that there's 12, 13, 14 trillion dollars that we didn't invest in our economy. That from the point of view of the families that I was describing earlier, that are working hard to try to get out of poverty, or the school kids that are trying to get access to the internet, or the families that are trying to afford housing, health care, or the other building blocks of middle class life, we might as well have just lit that money on fire. I usually carry around with me a list, I don't have it tonight, of what we could have bought for that, but here's some stuff we could have bought for that. We could have fixed every bridge in America. We could have fixed every road in America. We could have taken every backlog airport infrastructure project in America and fixed it. We could have fixed every port that has a backlog in America. We could have built high-speed internet out to every single rural community in America. We could have raised teacher salaries in this country by 50%. We could have given preschool to every kid in America who needs it. We could have made Social Security solvent for the next generation, for my daughter's generation. And we still would have had money left over to actually pay down our deficit a little bit. And we did none of that. And now the same people that have borrowed the money to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people and to fight wars in the Middle East based on false conclusions about weapons of mass destruction are the same people that say we can't afford to invest in our infrastructure. Maybe we should figure out how they could pay us back for all that stuff. But if we can't get them to do that, the least we could do is turn them out of office, put some other people in office. I'll be very brief, but I will be very brief.
Okay, we're going to try this. We're going to go here and then back there. I'm sorry, we're going to skip you too. I apologize. But I want to give Senator Bennet some chance to visit one-on-one with people. So, Kathy, you go first.
How about if I'm really brief?
Be brief. Be brief in your question.
No, I mean, because
We'll try.
I'm at the end of my rope.
I hear you. I think you speak for a lot of us.
Yes. Speaking of infrastructure, one of the most important, and you mentioned children, preschool. One of the most important things for me is early childhood, and that begins at birth, not just preschool.
Right.
And so you were talking about the taxes and borrowed money going elsewhere. What would be your solution to have every child, birth through 5, have quality environments so that when they do start kindergarten, they're at an even playing field and can go on gradually and take care of some of those issues?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, if you are a kid born into poverty in this country, you show up to kindergarten having heard 30 million fewer words than more affluent kids. And if you don't believe that it makes a huge difference for kids to have preschool and early childhood education going back 0 to 5, ask any kindergarten teacher that you know, and they will tell you that it makes a huge difference. This is going to require, just like the rest of our education system, is going to require a renewed partnership from the White House into states and to the local level, or maybe a better way of saying it is from the local level to states and up to the White House, because this can't be solved by any level of government by themselves. The proposal that I have that I think has the most merit right now is a massive increase to the child tax credit. It's called the American Family Act. And the American Family Act would provide a payment to everybody in America with a kid that's under the age of 6 and over the age of 6 up to 17. It would make it fully refundable, and what that means is that it would reduce. Princeton University has said, the professors there have said, this bill would reduce childhood poverty in America by 40%. It would end $2 a day poverty in America, and it would give families the ability to spend that money on preschool if that's what they wanted to do. Now, we have to make sure that it's not just, we got to make sure there's quality there too, because if there isn't quality there, it doesn't have the benefit and it's not useful to anybody. And that's where I think we need a president who's going to work with governors across this country to say, how are we, our goal is universal preschool. We're not going to get it tomorrow, but how can we put us on a path to getting there, because countries all over the world have it, and I think it's going to be a collaboration, just like the rest of the K-12 and higher education issues that I'm so concerned about are also going to require, but I'm not going to go into that right now.
I know Colorado is moving ahead.
We do. We have. And Denver also has. You know, in 1 year, in the Denver public schools, we went from having under 500 kids, 4-year-olds in preschool, to the next year having 2,000 kids in preschool. And I know there's more we need to do, but it's an example of what I could try to do.
Okay, back here.
Foreign policy question. In the Bennet administration, how would we retrieve, improve, salvage, whatever word you use, the current situations with North Korea and Iraq?
Iran and North Korea.
Yes.
So on North Korea, I would have much lower level people than the President of the United States engaged in North Korea. I would not go to the DNC. I would not tell people about the love letter we had exchanged or the fact that I had fallen in love with a despot who oppresses his own people and who has denied them any economic opportunity at all. I wouldn't imagine that this guy was himself some sort of real estate developer interested in building hotels on the beaches when he's starving the people that are his countrymen. So I'd like to think that any president other than Donald Trump would do what I just said. Because what he's been doing is so out of kilter, out of whack with what we've done in the past. I would engage the Chinese on the seriousness of the North Korean nuclear threat, and I would make sure that the Japanese and the South Koreans and we were joined at the hip as we were taking this very serious problem on. It is a very serious problem. But the way Trump looks at it, Barack Obama, trying to do Donald Trump a favor at the beginning of his presidency, said, Donald Trump, a threat that I am really worried about, that's keeping me up at night, is North Korea. And so then Donald Trump said, okay, well, I'm going to go solve that so I can demonstrate that I'm a much better president than North Korea. So he goes there, he gets this little, handful of magic beans in the form of commitments that the great leader made to, and his father made before him, and they never acted. And then from the time that the president tweeted out, you can sleep well tonight, until the day we're meeting today in Iowa, they've done nothing to slow down their nuclear program. So that's what I would say on North Korea. On Iran, I was there in 2016 to vote on the Iran nuclear deal. I voted for the nuclear deal. I was up for election in 2016, and my pollster told me the only vote we could not recover from was a vote for the Iran nuclear deal, because we didn't know what the Iranians would do, and we didn't, and it was all speculative, and people tend to believe that Iran is up to really bad things, and I believe that. I believe they're up to very malevolent acts from everywhere from Yemen to southern Iraq into Syria and into southern Lebanon. They are very, very dangerous. And unlike some people, they've been extremely strategic since we invaded Iraq and blew up the balance of power that existed in that region between Iraq and Iran. And they've taken full advantage of that. And that's why I thought in the end the nuclear deal with Iran, while it wasn't perfect, was so much better than what we had. Because for once, we were trying to deal with the problem in the Middle East by not going to war with that problem. And thank you. By the time Donald Trump became president, what was known and was not known when I voted for the deal was that every intelligence agency in the world said that Iran was complying with the provisions of the deal. And that Iran had been 2 to 3 months away from breaking out to a nuclear weapon when we voted for the deal, and they were now more than a year away from breaking out to a nuclear weapon. That doesn't sound like a big difference. It's a huge difference when you have to mobilize a bunch of allies to decide what we're going to do. 2 months puts Iran in the driver's seat to decide what they want to do to provoke us. A year means we get to decide what we're going to do. And unfortunately, because he blew up the Iran nuclear deal without any lifeboat to climb into, President Trump has now put us in the position where Iran is going to continue to test and test and test and test. And they're going to continue to do the malevolent stuff, the conventional terrorism that they're doing in the region, with the potential of being backstopped with a nuclear weapon. We cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We cannot ever allow Iran to get to the point where North Korea is. These are two very different situations, because one already has the weapon, one does not have the weapon. And we need to, and Barack Obama said this as well, we need to make sure we use any means necessary to keep it out of Iranian hands. But it's amazing to me that I thought that was the one promise that Donald Trump would actually break. that he made, because it was so unbelievably stupid to keep that promise based on the facts that we had. And I think now what we have to do on Iran is mobilize our allies again, go back to the negotiating table and see if we can get a better deal. I think we should try to get a better deal. There were flaws in that deal. Iran may want some things differently than they wanted the last time. We may want some things differently. But being able to put a cabin around that would be of huge value to us and to our European allies, and I think to the Middle East as a region. Thank you for the question.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for a great conversation about climate change and some extraordinarily important bonus issues. And one more round of applause for Mary.